I think it's fair to say few folks get into midnight reception work on cruise liners for the thrills. You opt for the quiet, the solitude, and heck, the weird charm of being the nocturnal face of a floating hotel. Me, I'd spent enough daylight hours manhandling drunk tourists back to their cabins on the Seafarer's joy to last me a lifetime. So, when the offer to swap sunshine for moonlight landed on my lap, I snagged it faster than a seagull on a sardine. The night shift is different. It's not just the time that changes, but the whole personality of the ship. The corridors echo more. The sea sounds louder when you look at the empty reception desk and see nothing but the low hum of dim lights reflecting off polished floors. The way I liked it, simple and predictable, until it wasn't anymore. Work gave me guidelines, what they called the primer to midnight reception, which I'd laughed off initially. Silly stuff, frankly, about how to greet the night owls and deal with sleepwalkers aimlessly wandering in their pajamas. A week into my tenure, though, and those ridiculous rules began to inch from amusing to indispensable. Take this one incident, for example. It was a night smeared in fog, thick enough that looking out the vast reception windows felt like staring into a pint of milk. I was killing the monotony by people watching. A lanky teen shuffling cards in an oversized armchair, a couple arguing in hushed venom about money or relatives or both. Normal until it was. Around 2 a.m., the air turned. I'm not talking about a cold draft or anything, it was the scent. The inside of a cruise shouldn't smell like wet dirt. Earthy, heavy, the kind that sticks to your ribs, makes you think of rain-soaked fields rather than open seas. I tried ignoring it, focused on reorganizing some misplaced brochures, but the smell thickened, clotting around me like invisible damp fog. Then there was Mrs. Henley, sweet old bird, usually all smiles and stories about her grandchildren. That night, though, she walked straight up to the desk, eyes puffy from sleep, nightgown on backwards. She leaned in too close, her breath tickled my ear as she spoke. "The walls are whispering again, dear." Before I could even toss her an accommodating smile, she huffed. "No one's fixing the whispers," she mumbled as she shuffled off back towards the elevators. I chalked it up to a bad dream or maybe a touch of seasickness. Everyone gets a bit loopy on the ocean now and again. But it was also precisely when I started taking those silly rules to heart. The night tick-tocked along, nothing but the usual until it wasn't. A sliver past 3:33 a.m., a time I only remember because it flashed so ominously on the phone display when it rang. It jarred me, that old traditional ring, because cell use is encouraged on board. The internal line trilled its old-school, urgent buzz. "Front desk, how can I help you?" My voice sounded hollow, too chipper for the hour. "It's Keith from engineering." The voice on the other end crackled like static stuck on an old vinyl. "I need to check some readings up there. Can you let me into the control room?" Protocol was clear. No one gets into the control room without a key card, especially not at this ungodly hour. "Sorry, Keith, you know I can't do that." There was a pause, dense and stretched thin like the last bit of toothpaste from a tube. "Right, I'll get the keys then." The line clicked dead, but the chill didn't end with the call. Keith didn't need to ask for access. All staff had night shift clearance. Something was off. I didn't have too long to dwell on it, though. Almost immediately after, a soft thumping started up. Systematic, like the heartbeat of the ship was suddenly audible. It pulsed through the floor, a rhythm that seemed to echo the tempo of my own heart as it climbed from calm to alarmed. The sight stopped me dead, a pale hand, impossibly pressing up from under the slate tiles of the reception area. A joke, it had to be, maybe a prank by one of the bored overnight crews. But no laugh came, just the solid, undeniable reality of cold fingers curling upwards from the floor, stretching out as if reaching, good God, reaching for my own trembling hand. My heart stuttered. The ghastly fingers reached out further, elongating with a sickening stretch, as if pulled by some invisible force beneath the tile. I jerked back, my breath a jagged edge in my throat, and pressed myself against the nearest wall. My eyes remained fixated on the spectral hand, fully extended now, its porcelain sheen gleaming faintly under the flickering lights. It was so real, so visceral, that I could almost hear the groan of its strained tendons. Taking a slow step forward, fueled more by morbid curiosity than courage, I watched as the ghostly appendage began to palpate the ground tentatively, like a blind creature searching for warmth. My skin crawled. The sight was revolting, yet tragically compelling. "Hello," my voice trembled, "listen." G through the static silence. The hand paused, and in that horrific moment of quietude, I wondered if it had heard me. Could it hear me? I stifled a laugh, a ridiculous question surely, for I was speaking to a disembodied hand reaching out from beneath the floor. Yet, as if in response to my voice, the fingers curled into a beckoning gesture. The terror that struck me then was primal, urging me to flee. But something deeper, something inexplicably intrinsic, rooted me to the spot. It almost felt like the hand was familiar, the way it twitched with an eerie semblance of human desperation. A colder wind whispered through the empty reception, the air thickening with dread. I dared to step closer when the tiles around the hand began to rise and fall, rhythmically at first, like the slow breath of a sleeping giant. Then, abruptly, the ground buckled and a crack splintered through the floor, branching out towards me like the vein of a decayed leaf. Each step I took felt heavy, laden with the kind of fear that claws at the edges of sanity. Trying to steady my breathing, I bent over the rising tiles. From the fissures, a chill seeped out, swaddling me in a cold embrace. My breath became visible, puffing out in anxious clouds. It was then I noticed, between the whispers of escaping air, a scent musty, like damp earth after fresh rainfall. A low moan echoed, so faint I thought my mind might be conjuring it from the substance of my fear. But then it came again, louder, a sound of pain, or was it longing? I reached into my pocket for my phone, the device suddenly feeling like a lifeline. Shaking fingers fumbled to activate the flashlight app, and a thin ray of light cut through the darkness, landing directly on the hand. The light seemed to animate it. With a slow, deliberate movement, the hand started dragging something from beneath. Horror mounted as the silhouette of a wrist emerged, then an arm, the skin ghostly white and marred by bruising. My scalp tingled, throat dry, as the realization hit like a grave bell's toll. The hand was attached to someone or something. A whisper shivered through the air, indistinct yet insistent. "Help me," it seemed to say, or did my terrified mind sculpt it from the wind's mournful howl? My gaze locked onto the emerging figure, and a suffocating tightness wrapped around my chest. I backpedaled, scrambling for any grip on reality, but it was slipping, each second spiraling deeper into this haunted madness. Then, abruptly, the hand stopped moving. It rested there on the cracked tile, lifeless, the moonlight casting long, ominous shadows around its form. Its pallor was unearthly, a stark contrast against the darkness around us. I stood frozen, torn between a visceral urge to run and the paralyzing intrusion of disbelief. A single question hovered in my petrified mind. What unearthed horror lay beneath these tiles, straining to break free? Yet, before I could muster the courage to uncover the truth, a low sob reverberated through the room, settling into the very marrow of my bones. And somewhere in the distance, behind me, the faint sound of footsteps approached, haltingly deliberate. It was coming from the long, shuttered corridor, where not even the overnight staff dared to tread after dusk. I turned slowly, every nerve standing alert, as the creeping terror of anticipation clawed its way up my spine. The silence seemed to constrict, tighter and tighter, around the corridor, as my footsteps echoed back to me, hollow and foreboding. The air was cooler here, musty with the scent of old decay and the less definable aroma of neglect. I could almost taste the dust motes, floating invisibly in the scant light that filtered in from the dying day outside the grimy windows. Dragging my hand along the wall, I felt the wallpaper, bubbled and peeling, scratch against my palm. The soft whisper of my skin against the decay was disproportionately loud in my ears, merging with the distant, indistinct wails that had drawn me here. The cries had diminished, folded into a disquieting silence that seemed to pulse with unspoken threat. As I moved forward, the beam from my flashlight jittered with my trembling hand, casting exaggerated shadows that danced along the walls like mocking specters. My heart hammered against my ribcage, a desperate drum signal calling me back to safety, but my feet carried me deeper into the corridor. Each door I passed was firmly shut, some with peeling paint that suggested years of abandonment. One door, however, stood slightly ajar. As I approached, a draft, a cold sigh from within, nudged it further open. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The instinctual part of my brain screamed at me to turn back, to flee the suffocating oppressiveness of this forgotten wing, but the cries I had heard, they were real, weren't they? With a resolve that felt brittle enough to shatter, I pushed the door open, my flashlight's beam invading the darkness of the room. It was an old patient's room, by the looks of it, untouched for decades. The bed with its rusted metal frame held the imprint of a body in the dust-covered sheets, and across the room, a wheelchair faced the window, its back to me. Stepping into the room, the floorboards groaned underfoot. I shuddered, the sound too much like a moan of pain. My light swept across the room, the shadows reluctantly giving way before it. Then I saw it on the walls, the faint, unmistakable stain of something dark and reddish-brown, possibly blood, turned black with age. Drawing closer, I reached out, fingertips hovering inches from the discolored wall, the rational part of me needing to confirm it was just rust or some other benign substance. But before I could touch it, a low sob broke the heavy silence of the room. It was so soft, so laden with despair, that I spun around, my own breath loud in my ears. There was nothing. The room was still, the only movement that of the curtain fluttering slightly, as if disturbed by a breath I couldn't feel. The sob came again, a mournful sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And then a voice, barely audible, whispered my name. "Why did you come here?" it asked, in a tone dripping with sorrow and dread. I wanted to answer, to scream, to deny I heard anything at all, but my voice was suffocated by the thick fear that filled the room. The floor seemed to sway beneath my feet, the room suddenly tilting as my head spun with the rush of adrenaline. Desperate for escape, I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam swinging crazily, until it caught something in the corner that hadn't been there a moment before. A figure, small and crumpled, its features obscured by shadow. My breath hitched, and every instinct screamed at me to flee, to escape this nightmare. But my legs were leaden, my feet glued to the rotting floor. As the figure slowly uncurled, rising from the darkness, the room chilled further, the air now a tangible pressure against my skin. The figure stepped forward into the light, and I saw its face, if face it could be called. It was devoid of features, smooth and pale, like a mask of sorrow molded from the very darkness of the room. It reached a hand toward me, a gesture that might have been pleading or threatening, I couldn't tell which. The air thickened, the past and present blurring into a single, horrifying moment of certainty that escape was no longer an option. And then, just outside the door, the faint echo of footsteps, aware, perhaps, of me, or of the figure that stood before me in the trembling light. A shiver of hope flickered through me, weak but insistent. "Help," I tried to shout, but the word was a mere whisper, torn away by the heavy darkness closing in. The figure paused, its head tilting as if listening, and for a breath everything held still, suspended in terror. The figure's head cocked further to the left, that unnatural, exaggerated angle that suggested a curiosity devoid of human warmth. The air grew colder around me. Each breath I took seemed to freeze in my lungs, a cruel imitation of life. I was rooted to the spot, my feet encased in an invisible cast of fear. The normal sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, had hushed as if the very earth itself waited in apprehension of what was to come. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt almost ceremonial, the figure began to move towards me. Each step was measured, almost hesitant, as if it were not quite sure of its right to intrude upon my existence. Yet, it continued its advance, and I, helpless to respond, watched it approach. Its form was obscured by the darkness, but I could make out the glint of something in its hand, a small, reflective object that seemed to pulse with a light of its own. Instinct screamed at me to run, to wrench my feet from the ground and flee into the protective embrace of the surrounding trees. But fear was a relentless captor, and I remained unmoved. The figure stopped barely a foot away from where I stood trembling. The object in its hand now clear, a dagger, its blade catching the moonlight and throwing it back with a cruel gleam. "Please," I whispered again, the word barely audible, my voice paralyzed as much by the surreal nature of the encounter as by terror. The figure paused, head still tilted in that disconcerting manner, as if it were trying to decipher my whispered plea. It leaned closer, and I could see now that where eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets that seemed to devour light and hope alike. A voice, rough and grating as if seldom used, came from it at last. "You are not meant to be here." The simplicity of the statement, rather than comforting, sent chills racing down my spine. There was a threat woven within those words, soft as they were spoken. Perhaps it was the certainty, the assertion of a rule I had unknowingly broken. I lost my way. I managed to stammer, my own voice sounding alien to me in the thick, watchful silence that followed. "It is not your path," it replied, each word articulated with the clarity of a death knell. The blade of the dagger was lifted, catching the light of the moon again, and my eyes followed the movement, hypnotized by the imminent peril. I understood then, with a gut-wrenching clarity, that this encounter wasn't random. It was an intersection of destinies that had perhaps been written in the shadowy depths of unfathomable realms. Panic, raw and powerful, finally broke through the paralysis. "No, please, I didn't know," I begged, the instinct to survive overtaking the numb terror. It regarded me for a moment longer, and in that brief span, I imagined 1,000 outcomes where darkness permanently claimed me. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, it lowered the dagger. I breathed out, a ragged sigh that seemed to leave my very soul lighter. "You will leave," it stated, not as a question but as a command. I nodded frantically, afraid that any sudden movement might change its mind. It stepped aside, and the forest path cleared before me, moonlight now appearing to form a guiding trail away from this nightmare. I didn't run. Running implied a pursuit, and I could not, dared not, believe I was being chased. Instead, I walked, fast but measured, my eyes never leaving the ground in front of me for fear of what might be revealed should I glance back. The sharp, clean air bit at my face, and I realized I was crying, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. Behind me, the darkness remained, heavy and expectant. A part of me knew it would always be there, lurking on the periphery of my life, waiting. As I emerged from the shadow of the trees, the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, a reminder that the night was temporary, but the horror of what lay within it was eternal.